like to welcome you to this year's Theosophy Science Lecture. Many of you may be aware that since 1983, the Theosophy Science Lecture has been a part of our annual international conventions. It was begun with the idea of the moving closer of the worlds that we would describe as the world of consciousness or spirituality and the study of science. Since the beginnings of these lectures, almost 40 years ago, we have witnessed in the scientific community an ever-growing minority at this point of scientists who feel that they are very much aware of the primacy of consciousness and the need for its exploration within the rigors of the scientific field. This year, we're doing this Theosophy Science Lecture in a slightly different format, in that we will have two people involved. One who is our presenter, Mr. David Lorimer, and the interviewee. We're going to do it in an interview format. So Dr. Ravi Ravindra will be our interviewer. Many of you know him. He's a person who has frequently been involved in the presentations around the world for the Theosophical Society. In fact, he was last year's Theosophy Science lecturer. He has degrees in both religious studies as well as physics. He's a retired professor, Professor Emeritus at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada, Nova Scotia. He's the author of numerous books on the intersection of science, spirituality, and he will be doing the interview portion. David Lorimer, who is our presenter this year, is the former director of the Scientific and Medical Network. For about 15 years, he served as the director of that. Currently, he is the program director and also the editor of the organization's magazine, The Paradigm Explorer. The Scientific and Medical Network is a creative and international group that is focused on transformative learning and change. And it's part of a worldwide growing network focused on spiritual emergence, which brings together people in the science fields. So scientists, engineers, doctors, psychologists, philosophers, all with the focus on a critical inquiry into the exploration of the intersection, the interfaces between science and consciousness, between well-being and spirituality. I think you will find you're in for a spirited conversation. During the course of this, we will have questions after the interview is finished. So for those of you for whom questions arise, please use the question box, the question button on your screen. So now I'd like to turn it over to our interviewer, Dr. Ravi Ravindra.
I'm happy to introduce my friend David Lorimer, whom I have known for several decades with great delight. First of all, just to tell him that the Theosophy Science program is clearly, obviously based on Theosophy is very interested in ancient eternal wisdom, and naturally the question arises, how does it really relate with or conflict with or agree with contemporary scientific enterprise? So given the fact that you have been very much involved with the Scientific Medical Network, and they are also interested in this very area, so I would very much appreciate, David, if you introduce something about the Scientific Medical Network and your own engagement with that. I know you have been engaged with them for many decades. So please proceed.
Thank you, Ravi, and thank you for the invitation. And hello, everyone who's listening to this. Well, it's a delight to be part of your Theosophy Science group for 2021, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions that you may have arising from this interview. Ravi has asked me to say a little bit about the Scientific and Medical Network and my involvement with that. The network was founded in 1973 by some distinguished scientists and doctors. And the basis on which it was founded was that there was too much dominance of scientific materialism in the education of scientists and doctors, so that the philosophy of materialism was taken for granted. What the founders wanted to do was open up to a wider worldview, which included the spiritual and indeed the psychic or parapsychological, and for science to proceed on a wider and deeper basis of assumptions, of metaphysical presuppositions. And so they got a number of people together for an initial meeting at Exeter University, and these included Dr. Peter Leggett, who was the Vice Chancellor of Surrey University, Sir Kelvin Spencer, he was Chief Scientist in the Ministry of Power, and then Dr. Patrick Shackleton, who was Dean of the Postgraduate Studies at Southampton Medical School, and George Blaker, who was the science side, but who'd been in the Department of Education and Science and was a civil servant in India. And so they sent out letters to other colleagues who they thought might be interested in forming a network. And a network was very unusual in those days. There wasn't really, I think the Scientific and Medical Network was the first network in the sense that we now use the term network, a kind of loose, informal association. And what they wanted to do was provide a forum or safe space so that the deeper questions of life could be discussed and explored without skeptical colleagues poo-pooing the very nature of the discussion. And so it grew fairly rapidly after that point. And I first became involved in 1986 when I received an invitation to join from George Blaker. At that time, and indeed since, the network has produced a journal, and I have been the editor of this journal, Paradigm Explorer, as it's now called, since 1986. So I've produced over 100 issues. And we have an extensive conference program, which at the moment is a lot of it through webinars and online events. And the flagship events that we have in our calendar are the Mystics and Scientists Conference, which went back to 1978, and Ravi has indeed been a speaker on this on a number of occasions, and the Beyond the Brain Conference, which we started putting on in Cambridge in 1995 with the Institute of Noetic Sciences in partnership with Willis Harman. And so the consciousness, the nature of consciousness, the interface between science and spirituality and science and esotericism and science and mysticism is a key theme of the network. And indeed, I was invited to give a series of lectures by the Theosophical Society in Australia in 2011. And I enjoyed a 3-week tour and met very many interesting people, courtesy of the then education director, Eddie Billamoria. And then coming up more recently, I just want to mention in the general context, the Galileo Commission. And the Galileo Commission was set up in 2017, and we commissioned a report from Professor Dr. Harold Wallach, who has a lot of specialities in history of science, philosophy of science, complementary medicine, parapsychology, and physics. So he produced a rigorous report which diagnosed where we are in terms of our science and science of consciousness, and argued for a move beyond the restrictions of materialistic philosophy, which assumes, and I call this the central dogma of neuroscience, which assumes that the brain generates consciousness. And so we now got over 1,000 people associated with that. We had 100 original advisors, among them Ravi, and we've got about 300 professional affiliates, so other academics and scientists who are interested and committed to the field. And then we've got a further 600 people who are interested. And we've just literally had our Beyond the Brain conference in the early part of November, which is our other flagship event. So I think that maybe is a good enough start in terms of the overall nature of the network and what we're trying to do.
Just one sort of almost like a footnote, why is it called Galileo Commission?
Ah, yes, you're quite right. I should have explained that. The reason it's called the Galileo Commission is that we feel there's an equivalence between a refusal to look through the telescope on the part of, for instance, the professor of philosophy at Padua. And this is described in a letter by Galileo to Kepler. And the refusal to look at any evidence which is inconsistent with or contradicts the basis of scientific materialism. And so the Galileo Commission is an invitation to look through the telescope and to widen the evidence base for a science of consciousness.
Good. And Galileo was called by Einstein as the father of modern physics. So I think it's good to, in a way, to honor him, even question the very thing he was promoting.
Yes, exactly, because he was one of the founders of the mechanistic philosophy and the emphasis on the distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities, so that the secondary qualities included consciousness, whereas we're trying to argue that the consciousness is primary rather than matter.
Yes. Now, I want to ask you another question, is about, you have been very concerned about what does it mean to be a real human. So please say, what is your understanding of being a real human?
Well, indeed, it's a central concern of mine. And I think there's a sort of multi-leveled answer to this. I mean, a human, if you speak in a metaphysical sense, has these different levels of identity, different levels of being in terms of the spirit, the soul, and multiple subtle bodies. This is the esoteric understanding of what a human is. Epistemologically, I would say a human is capable of gnosis, which is the knowledge by identity and the realization that the essence, metaphysical essence of the universe is love and light. But I think what's important in the current context is the human as humane and as humanitarian. And I've been very influenced by Albert Schweitzer in this respect, who argued for humanitarianism. And he argued for us becoming what he called, and I love this phrase, more finely and deeply human, by which I think he meant a component of understanding and wisdom, but more centrally, a component of reverence for life and compassion and care and ethic of the heart. So I think someone who's truly human is someone who lives not just from the mind, but also from the heart.
Yes, as we look around and look at all the political leaders running the whole world, controlling the economies, controlling the armies, they could start a nuclear war. Do you think any of them would correspond to what you define as a decent human being?
So in this sense of humane, I think that by and large, the people who run the political system, the economic system, the financial system are obsessed with power, money, and control. And so their values are by and large selfish or corporate values. And so they're out for their own success. And that really doesn't correspond to the common good. And so there are a few exceptions to this, because the problem goes back at least as far as Plato, who had this idea that the dispassionate guardians should be the rulers, and that there is an element of being a bit patronizing and paternalism here. But I think what he was getting at was how you reconcile power and goodness. And the philosopher, by definition, in that sense, is someone who is good and has the common good in mind. And there are, of course, some remarkable political people, statesmen. I think if you're an inspired politician, you become a statesman, such as Gandhi and Mandela, Václav Havel, the recent president of Uruguay, and someone like Dag Hammarskjöld, who I think is a huge inspiration. And he and Schweitzer were quite closely linked. And Hammarskjöld was scrupulous in maintaining a dispassionate and disinterested position in the various issues that he was trying to deal with, even under pressure from the great powers to bend to their will and against accusations of partiality. And so I think there are these inspirational models, but I think they're quite far and few between in terms of visionary political leaders.
I would also like to ask a very similar question. about all the people who would be highly regarded in the scientific and even theological, philosophical world, including many Nobel Prize winners, because you have met many of these people and have had many interactions with them. Do you find some of them or all of them close to being good human beings, as you would understand?
Well, this is something that you Ravi, covered in a recent course that you put on. That the scientists, intellectuals, and theologians they're not specialists in being like the sages. They're specialists in knowledge and in some cases being very, very clever and mathematically brilliant. What I'm talking about here is quality of the human being. That's what we are. We're not human doings or human havings. We're human beings, and that seems to me fundamental. And I have met some very inspiring people. I think a lot of the people I've come across have this understanding, like yourself. They integrate science and spirituality. They aren't one-sided, and they have concern for the larger whole. But I don't think that expertise in one area necessarily translates into your being a good, maybe productive human being, but not necessarily a good one.
But of course, since you are very much connected with the scientific medical network, and if you're meeting some of these people in that context, there is already a selection made. Otherwise, they won't be interested in scientific medical network unless they were also interested in trying to understand something other than just the materialistic science.
Yes, and actually this raises a very interesting point, Ravi, because if we go back to the origins of the Mystics and Scientists Conference in 1978, and Fritjof Capra is the only speaker who's still with us, and then there was a sense in those days of having the mystics on the one hand and the scientists on the other. Yeah. And I think what's happened in recent years is that the scientists who I invite, and you would be among those people, themselves have a mystical side, and so they're not purely scientific. They're people who try to integrate their science with their spirituality.
So you see, consequently, your sample of the scientists is naturally restricted. It's not that you have all the scientists, because unfortunately, at least in my experience, I was even at the Institute of Advanced Study, where they obviously end up getting highly creative scientists. I was really quite saddened, I would have to say, because many of them, I'm sure I would not wish to invite them for tea at my home. But it is also true, there are exceptions, some extraordinary people. For example, Freeman Dyson, I mentioned merely one example, very, very human. In fact, on one occasion, visiting us, ended up even washing the diapers of my daughter in some context. I don't want to go into the details of this, but very human.
Someone I knew a little bit, not nearly as well as you, but no, I agree. He's a very good example of someone. Well, I think if you have a family and you've got children and grandchildren, then you're also a family person as well as being a scientist.
Yeah. But now the question which is really relevant to our life in the society now, do you feel that there is enhancement of good human beings in the society, or is it decreasing their numbers, or are they increasing? What is your impression?
Well, of course, this is an impossible question to answer. And any question is going to be, any answer is going to be to some extent subjective, but I'd like to frame it within the work of David Hawkins, yes, who's produced a classic book called Power versus Force. And I think this is a central diagnosis, because what he means by power is in fact spiritual power, and what he means by force is violence, which produces its opposite reaction. And that's so non-violence. The Gandhian idea is something which represents spiritual power, or the power of love, or power of truth, if you like. And according to his analysis, and this was done by a kind of rating scale of emotions and spiritual development, and the key part on the scale is 200. And so anything below 200 is predominantly negative, and anything above 200 is moving into the positive. And he reckoned that in the last few years of his life, we'd just gone from about 194 to 207. So this would be, on his scale, something encouraging. So I think the other point I want to make is really that the news that we are fed and the propaganda that is spread by the news is mostly bad. And so it highlights the awful things that are going on, and deaths and corruption and so forth. And so we might, and Satish Kumar has made this point in a lecture he gave, we might be misled into thinking that the world is in fact a much worse place than it in fact is, because 99% of people are just going about their own business, and they're helping their neighbors, and they're helping their families, and they're supporting the community and so on. It's only a small number who are on the extreme. And so I was talking to my wife about this just yesterday. I do feel that there is some sort of groundswell going on, which is organizing itself like a self-organizing system to bring a new kind of relationships with each other, which involves mutual solidarity and care, and is a horizontal form of organization rather than being a vertical top-down, which is our usual kind of administrative arrangement. And so I think there is a sense in which people are waking up. But if I look in the big picture, and I was struck by a phrase from my friend Lawrence Freeman. He sent a letter from Glasgow, and letter number 4 talked about a pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will. And I thought that was a very interesting phrase, because I can't say I'm hugely optimistic about human prospects, but I feel that it's incumbent on me to do what I can to move things in a positive direction.
No, of course, we very much appreciate that. This is, in fact, one of the reasons for inviting you for this interview, because of your interest in promoting goodwill and good actions in the world. But there is increasing apprehension that more and more enhancement of artificial intelligence is really going to interfere with human beings' freedom to actually even choose to do good or bad, for that matter, but that they will all be treated like machines by the artificial intelligence. Do you have some remarks about that you would like to say?
Yes, indeed. And initially I'm reminded of a sentence from Ends and Means by Aldous Huxley, where he said that technological progress has merely provided us with a more efficient means of going backwards. And Schweitzer distinguished quite carefully between technological progress, social progress, and spiritual progress. And he always insisted that spiritual progress was the most important. So I think that we're really back to this initial premise about what is a human being. And for the transhumanists and technocrats and Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, most of them except Federico Fagin, we are just biological machines. And the machine metaphor is so much taken for granted that it doesn't occur to people to make the obvious distinction between a machine and an organism, which is obvious to any biologist. And so we are regarded as biological machines in need of an upgraded operating system. I mean, I think that the spiritual traditions also feel we need an upgrade, but that's not quite the same thing. And so to me, what the direction of travel, and I think the agenda has moved forward sharply in the last 18 months, is towards this technocracy, transhumanism, and surveillance and control through electronic means. And this is already appearing on the horizon, in my view, with the track and trace vaccine health passes or vaccine passports. And also another aspect of this, which many people don't appreciate, is the relationship between technocracy, control through technology, and the sustainable development goals, because a central plank of these is what they call smart cities. And a smart city is a city with a lot of 5G and 6G, which enables the Internet of Things and also the Internet of Bodies. And with the Internet of Bodies, your vital functions can be, and even your thoughts and feelings may eventually be able to be read out of a device or an implant, if we go that far. And then so everything will be uploaded into the cloud and used for commercial purposes. So I think the mechanistic metaphor is in bad need of an overhaul. And we need to go to a more living systems view.
Maybe if I take more or less really specific points from this mechanistic overhaul mechanism, is truth to be discovered only by the mind and only by science? So music, sculpture, they can all go to hell. They can't lead to any truth. How do we change that perspective?
Well, the magnum opus of Ian McGilchrist is just coming out. 1,600 pages, 5,700 references. It is about the means and ways to truth. And that's his fundamental exploration. And what he explains is that there are these analytical ways to truth. But then there's also, he talks about science, reason, imagination, and intuition as being paths to knowledge. And he elaborates on the possibilities and potential of each of these paths. And obviously, the means to truth depends on the level at which you are operating and your state of awareness. And so you can't get to gnosis or spiritual truth without using spiritual means and spiritual perception.
But you see, what has happened since the so-called age of enlightenment, which I regard to be a completely wrong label for this, that I can't recall any great poet who has been happy with this underlying assumption that only reason or science can lead to truth. For example, William Blake even regarded Newton, Francis Bacon, and Locke, the philosopher, as members of an infernal trinity. That is his remark. That's not my remark. Similarly, whether you read Wordsworth or Shelley or Keats, anybody, they're not really happy with this whole overlying idea that science is the only avenue to truth. So how do we actually encourage people to have some concern for whatever we mean by spiritual? Because it can be a very large area. We need to begin from wherever one is.
Yes, well, one very influential person in this respect is Goethe. And Goethe was both a poet and a scientist.
Yes.
And what he did, this is my understanding of it, is he developed what Brian Goodwin used to call the science of qualities. And so he complemented third-person objective, as it were, observation with first-person contemplation and empathy, where you feel into the nature of what it is you're observing, and you have a dynamic wish to understand the processes by which the plant develops into seed, develops into a plant, and develops into a flower, and then back into a seed. And so his interest was in becoming. But the wider question is the validation of spiritual insight and spiritual knowledge, which is also related to creativity, because the insights that come, and I just was reading the piece by Ian McGilchrist on Poincaré, for instance, so as a parallel to Mozart, who was able to, as it were, download an entire symphony and then just write it out.
Yes.
So I think there's a common source to creativity, and what Ian insists on is the key role of the right hemisphere in these processes, and the fact that we live in a left hemisphere dominated culture, which has created this sort of serious imbalances that we're talking about.
Yes. My own impression is that at present, there is a very strong tendency that every kind of science, say even biology through biophysics, chemistry through physical chemistry, geology through geophysics, or even psychology, that they all ultimately have to become branches of physics. My personal impression is that sooner or later, maybe within 1 century or even less, physics will become a branch of psychology. What's your impression about this?
that's a very, very interesting remark, and you can see why. Well, theology was the queen of the sciences in the Middle Ages. Then physics becomes the queen of the sciences, and I think if you move in a direction of the primacy of consciousness, or the fundamental nature of consciousness, as explained by Planck and Schrödinger and other great physicists, Pauli, in his interaction with Jung, then you could see that everything actually branches out from consciousness and attention, and the way that we actually pay attention to things. This is another of Ian's points, that the left hemisphere has a focused attention and the right hemisphere has a broader attention, and they obviously need to work together. And so I think that's a pretty good forecast, but I'd hope that it would be a transpersonal kind of psychology rather than a reductionist one, if you're right.
Well, a reductionist one becomes a branch of physics, so that is not going to...
That is true, yes, yes, yes.
Now, but how do we encourage particularly really young people to take more and more interest in spiritual matters? Because it's not that one needs to be in any sense against the scientific knowledge, that would be quite silly. But how to see the limitations or the underlying assumptions of scientific knowledge, and that there is something about their own life. After all, whatever I call myself will die in a few decades. In my case, really only a few more years. And so how do we encourage our young students or young people generally?
At an early stage in its development, the Scientific and Medical Network had a week-long course for under 25s called Wider Horizons. And the intent of this course, which consisted of one person coming every 24 hours and talking about their area of expertise and leading meditations, and then they also had some craft work and sculpting and dance and movement. So the idea was to open them up and to cover some of the areas that are not covered by the conventional curriculum. I myself try to do this in my Inspiring Purpose work, which is a character and values program for young people. The way that this works is that I give them a template, the first part of which consists of thinking about themselves in terms of their qualities and what they need to develop and what they're good at. So self-awareness and self-knowledge. And then it proceeds on to inspiration, and then on to aspiration, in terms of asking questions like, what do you want to achieve and contribute in your life? Not just achieve, but also contribute. And what are your ideas for a sustainable future? And so the purpose there is to enable young people to find out what is already implicit inside them, to draw out, as education literally means, and so that they begin to develop a philosophy of life of their own. But I think in terms of interesting young people in spirituality, quite a lot of them are interested in yoga. Fewer, I think, probably in my experience, are interested in meditation, but they might come round to that. But I think it's our life experience, essentially, which raises these questions for us. And one of my colleagues, Oliver Robinson, is a specialist on what he calls the quarter-life crisis. So mid to late 20s seems to be when you first systematically start asking, well, what am I doing here and why am I here? If you haven't asked these questions already, then quite often these will arise around that phase of life.
Well, one question I'd like to ask you really, and that I ask myself the same question. Are we just from the very, maybe because of some previous lives or from birth, privileged to have certain kind of interest, certain kind of search? Or is it something that accidentally one comes across? Or is it something that you are now suggesting we could actually install in our educational system to bring about a search for the quality of one's being, not only the quality of one's knowledge?
Yes, well, from my own part, around the age of 30 or so, I kind of remembered who I was at a deeper level. And this of course, corresponds to the Gnostic or Gnostic idea that there's a fall into separation and a fall into forgetfulness, fall into sleep, and the job is to wake up and remember that you are more than just the physical body and personality. So I think that's intrinsic, but how to put it into the educational system. And in England, for instance, what used to be called religious instruction then became religious education, and now it seems to be evolving into comparative worldviews, which I find quite interesting. But what's missing in the actual syllabus is any reference to practice. So you're not introduced to practices which are the essence of the spiritual life. And so I think you'd need to do that. I mean, I tried to do this even when I was teaching 30 years ago, 35 years ago. Now I introduced my pupils to basic meditation techniques and just to give them a little bit of space and silence inside. And I think that's what's missing in young people at the moment. And they've got so much, attention-seeking technology that they find it very difficult to go inside.
See, it seems to me one of the almost the fundamental remark or enunciation practically in all spiritual teachings is that there are many levels of reality subtler than the mind. For example, in the Bible, we have 9 orders of angels. They're all spiritual, but so it's a very large realm. How do we invite people to bring something other than their mind to relate with reality?
Yes, well, that again is a matter of practice, as we both know. It's difficult to envisage, that kind of esoteric teaching being brought into the classroom, other than by very special teachers who happen to have developed that interest themselves. I suppose what we're getting at here is, how do we identify the limits of the mind, or limits of the left hemisphere, and the limits of what can be apprehended at different levels, and by implication, the limits of regarding yourself as only a body with consciousness, and which is obviously the sort of standard prevalent view.
Well, David, I think it'll be good for you to, whatever you wish to add to, these are people obviously interested both in eternal wisdom, or ancient wisdom, if you like, and science. So what would you like to say to them, to encourage them to at least admire the fact that they are interested in both? But please take your time to say that.
Well, I was thinking earlier on that we need a complementary approach here. We need to balance out our inner and our outer lives, and that's something that each of us has to address in our own way. I myself do this through my spiritual practice, which is partly meditation. I also do movements from my spiritual teacher, Peter Dunov, who's a Bulgarian sage. And in these movements, you invoke the blessing of God, you invoke divine love in your soul. May divine love live in my soul. May divine justice grow within me. These are all affirmations that correspond to particular gestures. And I do these every day. And then when I'm walking in nature, I try to put my mind in neutral and be completely present. This afternoon, we were walking in the autumn rain and mist, and it was incredibly beautiful in its own way. And so I tried to allow myself to become absorbed in that, to make enough space for silence, to slow down, because we are creating and speeded up world, and to have a sense of service. What can we actually do for each other? And I think what's important in terms of expanding science is to realize that there are these different interfaces which the network is very much concerned with. We're less concerned with the interface specifically between science and Christian theology, and science and theology generally. But what we are concerned with is the interface between Science and Mysticism, the Mystics and Scientists Conference, Science and Spirituality, and Science and Esotericism. And I know that the big magnum opus that Eddie Villamoria will be publishing next year, which I've been helping on the editing side, and he makes a very good case for a new metaphysical basis for science being an esoteric framework. And I very much sympathize with that, and I agree with a great deal of what he says. And this means, for instance, expanding the notion of the human being into a more traditional understanding, also expanding the number of bodies. It's not just the physical body, because one of the things that the Western philosophers always come up against in discussing the Cartesian mind-body problem is they say, well, how can you have an interaction between something that's extended and something that's unextended? Yeah. And this completely ignores the tradition that there's not only a physical body, but there are also subtle bodies, which have been articulated also in Western esotericism. So I think we're living in a time of integration. It's extremely important to integrate the inner and the outer, science and spirituality, left and right hemispheres, masculine and feminine. We're living in a time of the arrival and the absolute necessity for the sacred feminine to make itself felt. So integration, I suppose, would be a key word here.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your input. And
well, I enjoyed that. I hope that that's what sort of thing you were looking for.
Very much.